You know, in Paul's writings to the Corinthians, he talks about the gifts, and at the end of that wonderful chapter that we call the love chapter, he says, it's these three things: faith, hope, and love. The greatest of these is love. Faith, hope, and love. We've spent the last 3 weeks, now fourth week, on this series, this final time for this series on hope. And the more I kind of get into the hope and think about hope and how is it that how we experience hope, the more I just get a sense that sometimes these three words, they just kind of all somehow are connected: faith, hope, and love. You know, the idea that you can have hope without having some kind of faith or love seems kind of tough. Or that you could have love without having some kind of hope or faith. Or that you could have faith without hope and love. It seems like we're all talking about something that's very much the same or connected. Hope. Hope. Where do we learn in our lives? Where do we learn what to hope for? How much to hope for? You know, I've watched a lot of TV in my life. I wish I could say that was not the case. But I have watched a lot of TV in my life, and my belief is that a lot of the training that we get into what to hope for, we get from media, we get from images that get presented to us, And if you were to take all of the TV that you've ever watched in your life and you were to somehow kind of categorize it into what was it teaching you to hope for, how would you feel about that? How would you feel about what you had been taught to hope for? Faith. I sometimes wonder if the word faith couldn't be boiled down to something that has to do with hope and love, and maybe the word trust. Maybe the word trust. Somehow we all, from the time we were born, kind of learned a little bit about trust and how much to trust. Do you trust the people around you? Do you trust the ones caring for you? In Erickson's stages of psychosocial development, it's the very first stage, trust versus mistrust, which he thought was the most important. That in the first 18 months of life, we would all have some predisposition that would develop toward either having a sense of trust or not. And that we would, as I understand it, have developed scripts around that. Do I trust life? Do I have a trusting approach to the generosity and the benevolence of creation? Or have I, from very early on in my life, learned to be very cautious and very careful, to find the world and the people and creatures in it as not trustable? It's hard to have hope. And it's hard to have faith without some sense of trust, some maybe predisposition towards trust. But we've all experienced things in our lives that have taught us not to trust. We've all learned to kind of be more careful with what we expose to others and a little bit more careful about putting our energy into something, to invest, to give our energy to anything can feel very, very vulnerable. When Martin was sharing a minute ago, though I was a little distracted by his keys, I'm going to start wearing my keys on the outside because I think that's the new hip thing to do. So, Thanks. They're handy. I like to, Martin is such a great gift, and he's been such a great addition to this staff. But I never get to see him, so this is a good chance to kick some dirt see what happens. But as he was talking about the whole stewardship campaign, I think about this whole idea of what it means for a community to really fully invest themselves. And frankly, most of us don't fully invest ourselves in anything. Because we've learned you don't do that. If you fully invest your life into anything, you can really get let down. We've learned you can have hope. You can have hope, but keep it as a kind of intellectual experience. You can have trust, but as my grandfather and I used to joke about, we played cards all the time. We would play rummy in the evenings when I lived with them after my parents' divorce. And we would sit at the dining room table while my grandmother baked pound cake after school, before dinner or after dinner. We would play cards. My grandfather always amazed me because we would play contract rummy where you'd have like 12 cards in your hand, and he would go down and win the game, but he would pull cards from he had not organized his hand. I mean, it was in his head, and it would always astound me. But in our kind of joking and stuff, for Christmas one year, I gave him a little paper clip, kind of big clip thing that said on it, "Trust everyone, but cut the cards." We all have a little bit of that in us, don't we? It's like, I want to trust that the youth program is doing good work, but, I'm not going to fully invest in that. I want to trust that this community that I'm a part of is doing good work, but I'm not sure I can fully put my cards on the table with that. I mean, it's what we do. We're careful. We're careful with our hearts. We've all learned to be a little safe. But what I want to just play with today is, where did we learn what to hope for? I may have learned that it's okay to hope for a little positive thing to happen when you get around other people. Maybe we sing a few songs and we get a little happy. But I may not have ever gotten any sense of the possibility that a community that I gather with every week could become like a family to me, that could become an organized, massive movement of people doing good in the community, that I might be able to depend on people to be a part of my life and to give support to me when I am in need, and I can do the same. What do you hope for, even for where we are today, right here in this room? What do you hope for? And where did you learn to hope for that? Trust is mixed into the whole mix, because somehow having a sense of trust that something better than I've imagined could happen, that requires a certain amount of courage when you've had some losses in your life, or when you've had some betrayal in your life, when you've had expectations that have been blown. But to have hope and to have that courage may be the most important thing in our lives. As I shared a couple of weeks ago, some of the research on hope, and particularly this 12-item hope scale that's been found to be more predictive of positive outcomes in things like law school and even healthcare, seems to be more predictive than SATs, suggests that hope and having a sense of hope is really, really important, both to our individual lives and to our world. How do you recognize the limitations to your hope? And as I was suggesting, they find that hope is not a fuzzy thing. It's not that fuzzy thing that we have always kind of taught, we have hope. It's about two things. It's about having agency, a sense of agency that I want and can and will accomplish something. And it's about having pathways that you're actively following and the ability to find new pathways when those get frustrated. I look around and see a world full of hopeless people. I see a community that has become hopeless at dealing with a mound of issues, from the polarization of our culture and politics to the crime and issues of how we deal with it, the educational systems that seem stuck in a model that has long ago become unsuccessful, to neighbors who don't know each other, to perhaps finding that path, that new journey, that way of healing, the way of new beginnings. Doesn't it have to begin with at least a glimmer of hope? Otherwise, we step back and walk away. Otherwise, we lower our hopes and don't have the kind of high hopes that Jesus was talking about in the gospel. We lower ourselves to that place where in Romans, Paul is talking about, hope is not the stuff you already have. If it's that, that's not hope. So many of us have found ourselves content to live with the way things are and to give up on hope or to just give it lip service. And yet, what I want to suggest to you this morning is the difference between living in a world of hopelessness and living in a world that is moving towards what Jesus called the kingdom and what others have called many other things like the great feast or the great communion. That place where the lion lies down with the lamb and we live with a more distributive justice than a retributive justice. The difference between a world of barbed wire fences and a world where people are feeding each other and caring for each other may not be more than this much difference. Just look at this room. This many people have been coming to 1111 for about 10 years. Now, why hasn't it gone down? Or why hasn't it gone up? Maybe it's because of the size of the room. It may well be, actually. We seem to conform our expectations to the space given. Right? Church growth people will say that once a room is 80% full, it's no longer attractive to new people. In other words, for this community to continue to grow, all of you would have to get comfortable with standing in the back. Who's willing? What I'm saying is the expectation that somehow we've got to have a community that fits the size of the room can't change until something inside of us changes. That says, what we have here has more value than we're giving it. And I believe that's true for every one of you. That what you have in you has more value than you're giving it. And that when you raise the hope that that could make a difference, as we all do that together, that something magic can begin to happen. And I don't think it takes that much. I think it's like Jesus said, it's the grain of mustard seed. It's the small thing that moves mountains. Faith, hope, love. Not lip service, but with a real path. It says, I start here today. I commit myself to that now. I can't get there today. Otherwise, it wouldn't really be hope. But I begin now. Amen.